Responding to Godless Communists, Soviet Antireligious Propaganda. Propaganda is a technique of communication that relies on stereotype and manipulation to achieve its aim of shaping attitudes, controlling behavior, and silencing thought and dialogue. While propaganda is considered here within a specific historical moment, it continues to have an impact on the world. This video was created to examine the primary functions of propaganda in the hope of enhancing the potential for learning through the objects in this exhibition. SCMA invited people from a range of backgrounds to share their thoughts, whether scholarly or personal, in their own words and from their own perspectives. We thank each of the participants for their generosity of time and ideas. Well, the first impetus for the exhibition was we were doing all of these other exhibitions that had to do with specifically Christianity, but mostly, art and belief, art and religion. And we had this idea that we would want to have a string of pearls, a bunch of connected exhibitions that we could then talk about a big theme. And I was rolling around ideas in my mind. I was like, well, I could do just a general religion in prints, but that's not very interesting. I was like, well, we do have these Soviet anti-religious posters, which are sort of interesting. We've recently had them conserved, and I know that Nancy Rich, who was the curator of education, had a lot of professors that she thought were interested in potentially using them for classes. So I said, something different, something, not religious per se, but on the subject of religion, something in the collection that we haven't really researched deeply, that this might be a way that we can learn more about our collection and do something that's a little different.
That this kind of art, which I think was called agitprop, that means agitation and propaganda. That was under the Department of essentially Education and Culture. That this, there was artistic policy, but pedagogy. Essentially the goal was to re-educate the Russian people from the ancient regime, the pre-revolutionary Tsarist bourgeois culture to the new Soviet culture.
Art is something special activity of human being when we express what we feel, what we think, and those things should really bring us to the next level in our spiritual life. Other words, art is something that should make us better.
My understanding is that the Soviets, in the early years especially, were anti-religious, but not anti-Jewish, and they took great pride that they weren't anti-Semitic, and that they were kind of combating what had been a very traditional, virulent anti-Semitism in the Russian society, and that they were kind of transforming that into being anti-religious and trying to include the Jewish community into the proletariat, into their, their vision of a society of equals. And so they focused specifically on Jewish imagery, and that would help explain why perhaps it's not, the worst of the anti-Semitic imagery that could ever be envisioned.
I think the goal of the arts, literature, the arts and culture was to be what Stalin later called engineers of souls. He addressed writers, that's later in the 30s, you are the engineers of souls. Therefore, your task is to build, all right? And therefore, the techniques, even the technological term, engineers, not creators, but engineers, technological manipulation. Therefore, propaganda was not a bad word. Agitprop was a kind of high function of militant art.
Those pictures, posters, they really have something different subject. And it is difficult to call art. It's, propaganda or some kind of things which was used against the church and against the culture and against the people.
mean, people who really know the Orthodox Church and could see the fact that they were taking details from that faith and twisting them and knowing how that affects people. That's when I realized, really how insidious and effective and brutally nasty these things are. And the level at which they're operating, these people who are attacking the religions knew them very well and knew exactly where to insert the knife and exactly how to twist it to make people really uncomfortable.
During those years, Russia lost several millions of people, and to be precise, more than 200,000 priests were killed during that time, and about 500,000 of priests were persecuted in the jails. So we're talking about very terrible time.
My grandma was 12. She was 12 when she was deported. In the past, they worked for the church, they sang for the church, or they knew the priests in some way or another. Was really an incriminating enough reason to deport them to Siberia. She was able to come back in 9 years afterwards, and it was really, really hard to come back. They had to work for different channels to be able to come back. But still, when they were back, they weren't able to acquire everything that the communists took away. They had to start from scratch, and they didn't have land, they didn't have house, they didn't have anything. They didn't have lots of members of their family because while they were gone, they were killed.
My maternal grandfather was born in Kiev, and he fled to the United States as a result of Stalin's regime. His parents died early in the regime. They both, I can't remember exactly how, but I know there was a tremendous amount of strife and stress and personal loss.
There had been a church here, a little chapel in the middle of, essentially at the crossing of two streets. And to think, and it was torn down. And I said, well, was it torn down by the order of the government during the revolutionary? And he says, well, no, it didn't even have to have the order of the government. He said, that's what I find most reprehensible, that the local people organized and went further than the government, demanded that these monuments be destroyed, because that's the result of this indoctrination.
Until the communists came, they closed the churches, and they took draperies and just covered all the icons. And they would have clubs, disco clubs in there. They would invite people to come to play basketball there. And the shooter that would throw the best would be the one who would shoot into some icon or cross. And just bigger the impact is, if they break the icon or the cross, more props to them. My grandma was telling me how she and her father would sneak in the middle of the night and just collect pieces of crosses and icons that they would see lying on the floor and run away, because they knew if they're caught, they will be deported, which they were later on. They were deported to Siberia.
Religion is kind of soul for the society. And we all know body without soul is the dead body. And it is exactly what happened in Russia. For many, many years, when church was persecuted, when so many people were killed because they had faith in God, we all know during the time the Soviet Union wasn't really a spiritual country. But at the same time, we remember the past before that and the beauty of Russian culture.
I know it's really hard to be dispassionate about looking at these. Certainly, we're trying to frame it in a way of, looking at how propaganda works and using this almost as a case study, looking at them as pieces of propaganda and understanding that this was an attempt on the part of one party to change people's minds and behaviors and really control them, and looking at them from that vantage point rather than simply reacting to shocking imagery, because that's actually what the propagandists want you to do.